You could start with your name and job title, please.
My name is Daniel Gallan. I'm a freelance sports journalist.
Sir, I brought you here because you and I are probably the most obsessed people in the world when it comes to Neil Wagner. I think you would argue that I'm far more obsessed, which is fine, but I'm still putting you, I still think I'm putting you at the very high upper echelons of Neil Wagner-ness. But I want to start with this. As a South African, do you think it's weird that South Africa either don't produce left arm seam very often or don't care that they don't produce left arm seam very often?
You know, wow, that's here I have been preparing for a Neil Wagner chat, and you've thrown a curveball, almost as like a southpaw would, a sneaky southpaw. Yeah, I do think it's weird. I mean, we know how potent left arms can be, how left armers are fast tracked if they're any good because batters aren't used to the angle, etc. Growing up, that if you can bowl above 135 with a left arm, you're probably going to be playing first class cricket at some point. So yes, I do think it's weird. And I don't think it's a conscious thing. It's not like, we often hear, I interviewed Wayne Parnell about this, and I wrote a whole extended metaphor over 2,000 words about how he's so different. He doesn't like to play golf or fish. He likes to model sneakers and take photographs and post them on Instagram. And I kind of used that as a metaphor about how he's a little different, not from the mold, and he also bowls left arm, which in South Africa is different and not from the mold. But really, I was mostly using his quotes. It's not necessarily something I believe. It's not like I think that Graham Smith or South African conservatism is just not promoting left armers. I just think it's one of those weird anomalies, like why the Proteas haven't won a men's World Cup yet. I just think it's one of those things that have happened in cricket. So yeah, it's weird, but I don't think it's any conscious decision. I mean, I remember when I was playing, not that I was very good, but I played, district cricket in South Africa, and I remember facing a lot of left armers, and for whatever reason, none of them, apart from Parnell, was able to burst through.
Yeah, I played indoor cricket with two guys who played, top level schools cricket, and they played against, the majority of the team and knew them all quite well, and they were both left arm quicks, and Brett Schultz, of course. And Neil Wagner, it's not that there's no left armers in South Africa, but it is interesting. Because I do think if there was, I'm not saying they're anti-left armers, but I do think if they were a bit more like, say, Pakistan, who's thirsty for left armers, right? I wonder if Neil Wagner, when he first starts to say he's going to leave, they go, well, mate, have you thought about going to this first class setup? Or have you thought about going here? Because he clearly was one of the best young left arm talents in the country. He's probably maybe about the same age as Parnell, maybe a year or two on either side, right? And yet they just let him go.
Well, when he was at the Titans, and the players ahead of him were Albion Morne Morkel, Andre Nel, and Dale Steyn. And at the time, there were just six first class franchises, much like Australia, only a few teams. And you didn't really see a lot of change. Surprisingly, looking back, I don't have the teams to hand, but I don't know why he couldn't have gone to the Warriors or the Lions, who at the time I know didn't have the strongest bowling. This was sort of before KG Rabada came into the attack and led from the front at the Lions. So there's no reason why he couldn't have gone. But I guess he figured, hey, I could move to another province, but I'm definitely not going to be playing for South Africa. And look, when I spoke to him, he's not a guy who is anti South Africa. You don't talk to him and he's like, oh, that place has gone to I don't know if I can swear, to an S-hole, We
did a whole episode about salt penises, and now you're worried if you could swear on my podcast.
That's right. Yeah, so because maybe some white South Africans will be upset with what I say, but I've met too many white South Africans that have moved abroad and say, aren't you glad that you don't live in that shithole anymore because the ANC has run it to the ground, and et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to go there. But Wagner's not one of those guys. But I think that he recognized that there was an opportunity to forge a new life and see a new part of the world and play a bit of cricket. So I don't think he tried every available opportunity to him to stay in the country. I think he saw an obstacle at the Titans and by extension South Africa, and figured, you know what, I'm gonna go. If I'm gonna leave Pretoria, I might as well leave South Africa. And I think that was his mindset.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I also think that we think about these things because of the way we've been brought up in cricket to think about it as, oh, he's leaving his team. But, you know, you listen to Davy Jacobs and Grant Elliott and Neil Wagner, and they talk about other things. They talk about family life. They talk about professionalism, or, you know, all those other things that you forget that that's also what they're involved with, right? Like, and that's the interesting thing for me is he didn't just go the easy route of going Kolpak, which is really, really, I think that's a fascinating part of what he did, and maybe explains why he's never taken the easy journey in any particular, even the way he bowls, right? But he gets offered contracts with Hampshire and Sussex. I assume they were quite low contracts, but also, reading between the lines, they were obviously going to offer him more money than Otago was going to offer him, right? But Otago certainly made a bigger play of, if you come over here, you're not that far away from being in the New Zealand national side, whereas obviously he was second 11 cricketer for Sussex. He's a long way away from playing for England at that point.
That's right, and the opportunity to work with Mike Hesson was a big character as well. He speaks really highly of him as a coach. I remember. I wrote this piece. I can't remember when it was. Last year, I think. Before the South Africa New Zealand series, and he didn't speak of Mike Hesson as a coach who spoke about wrist positions or front leg bracing or anything like that. He just spoke of him as a coach that just truly backed him, that almost assured him that if you do come over, I see something in you that you can be a test cricketer. And, you know, you've spoken to enough players to know that coach that just believes in you is worth 10 coaches who can correct your wrist position or what you're doing with your shoulders or how to swing a ball away. Just having that belief, because I mean, look at, and I'm sure we'll talk about him as a bowler as well, but to do what Wagner does at 37 with those knees, to charge in and just be a bouncer bowler, in an era where the margin for error to bowl a bouncer has been so greatly reduced. I think beyond talent and ability, which of course he has, and we saw that with that spell that got rid of that spell up front when the keeper was standing up. Oh God, who did he get to? Was that first when he got Pope out? When against England recently. He's obviously a skillful bowler, but I think he's just got that belief and that tenacity, and I think a lot of that came from Hesson when he first moved over to a new country. I think he just generally deep down believed that he would make it, and a lot of that is the coach. So I think in the Neil Wagner story, Mike Hesson needs a lot of work, a lot of credit.
Well, the interesting thing about that is he's picking someone who, even if you knew anything about cricket, you weren't thinking, well, this guy's going to be a major player in New Zealand cricket in the next couple of years. Mike Hesson wasn't, you know, that kind of person at that stage, but obviously Wagner saw something in him. The other thing is I went back and read all the old, I had to find the Otago, I forget the name of the newspaper, but I went back and actually read all the old Otago news reports, because when Wagner moves to New Zealand, it's not like it's on Cricinfo, right? Like, it's not a story. Right. Even the Hampshire and Sussex things, you can't find anything written down. It's mostly, we know that he played second 11 cricket for Sussex, and then we know through Wagner he was offered 2 deals, right? There's no media around it. But you go back and you read Hesson's comments. It's really interesting. Hesson's saying this guy's averaging 18 in first-class cricket. Doesn't say that it's not franchise cricket. Doesn't quite tell everyone that it's the second 11, but that's fine. Yeah. But it's clear that he has looked through looking for bowlers or players with incredible records who aren't getting pushed in South Africa, and to bring him over. That alone is very different than you taking a few wickets in Liverpool and Sussex giving you a trial, right? That's a completely different situation where this guy's like, mate, I think you're going to be the best bowler in the world. Come here and I will help you do that, rather than we'll throw you a contract because you're a left armer and you're already taking wickets in Liverpool. So he must have felt very wanted, and at that point in his career, he wouldn't have felt very wanted. In fact, you talk about the political stuff. It is worth saying that at the time, he did say that the political scene in South Africa was part of the reason why he wasn't getting a go, which, as we've just said, Andre Nel, Dale Steyn, LB Morkel, Morne Morkel, as far as I'm aware, they all count as white South Africans. So that's right. I don't think the problem was particularly race-based, and he's changed his mind on that since. But
yes,
he definitely, I don't think, would have felt wanted in that system, whereas Hesson probably made him feel wanted in a way that no one else had.
Mm. Yeah, 100%. And we must, you say it was for the second 11, but because there were only 6 first-class franchise teams playing, yes, there were a lot of pretty average players. And, this is me, Daniel Gallan, with my very, very average cricket skills, calling professional cricketers average. But there were some very good players playing in those second 11. The feeder team for the Titans called the Northerns, or the Gauteng side that was feeding the Lions. KZ and Coastal feeding the Dolphins. There were some very good players. It was in that period in particular. Maybe that was the last period where there were some very, very good players playing in that system. And I guess the demise of that second tier is partly why we South Africa have gone to the provinces and away from the 6 franchises. But at that time, those feeder teams were strong, and you could bank that if a guy does well in that tier, he'll go up and be ready for franchise, and therefore be ready for Test cricket eventually. So, yeah, it was when I interviewed him. I was trying to cast my mind back, and I listened to a bit of the audio. I did ask him about feeling wanted, about feeling ignored, and he wouldn't take the bait. Either he hadn't contemplated it, or he overtly just didn't want to revisit those memories. But he wouldn't say that. He never said that I felt disaffected by things. I mean, he kind of circled it, and he said, look, I was frustrated that I wasn't getting my opportunity. But when I spoke to him, he never sounded bitter. I've spoken to many South Africans that have left, and we all know, obviously, most famously, Kevin Peterson. I mean, Kevin Peterson is many things. Bitter is one of them. I don't ever feel that Neil Wagner was bitter. I don't think he's bitter. I mean, look, he's had a great career, so why would he be? But yeah, I think if he was bitter, that bitterness has been sweetened over time. Does that work?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that none of us knew who he was beforehand to ever talk to him right at that time. And even the Otago newspaper reports, it's a couple of lines. Like it's not journal. I don't want to slag off the great work that the Otago paper did, but they're not trying to get to the bottom of who Neil Wagner is as a man. They've literally been told to go to Otago. There's a new player that they're unveiling today, and ask him 3 questions, right? And they did that, and they covered it very well. And there's a couple of follow-up articles as well, but again, nothing that deep. The interesting thing is that, for me, and I say this as a cricket person, when I want to say, I'll get his name wrong, but I think it's Obeas Pinar, the left arm all-rounder. Devon, I may have made that name up, but there was a left arm all-rounder who I think was playing cricket in America last time I checked. But when he left, I remember a lot of people saying to me, that's a big loss for New Zealand cricket. Devon Conway was a big deal. Even though they thought he was a failure, they actually still thought Devon Conway's a real player. And that's not an easy person to replace, even if he's never made any runs. There have been other players as well. Ricky Vessels is another one, some of the Kolpak players. Wagner, outside of Glenn McGrath mentioning him in his 2003 World Cup diary and spelling his name incorrectly, by the way, it doesn't feel like anyone really noticed that he had left. Now, I'm sure locally they did, but it doesn't make the same sort of ruffles. And even when he starts to be successful in New Zealand, no one's going, oh, it could have been. Everyone's like, nah, he wouldn't have made it here anyway.
I think the fact that he was doing it for New Zealand, and even Conway, who you quite rightly say felt like a loss at the time, mostly because journalists and the cricket nerds on Twitter had been paying attention to Conway. Obviously the powers that be didn't consider him a big enough loss. Otherwise they would have done something about it. But I think because he played for New Zealand, if he'd gone to Australia, I mean, people talk about Labuschagne / Labuschagne as a bigger loss than Wagner, even though Labuschagne went when he was 11.
Yeah.
I think the fact that they played for that Conway and Wagner played for New Zealand, the quote-unquote nice guys of world cricket, if you're going to lose to anyone, you want to lose to them, etc., etc. They, look at their cute little grounds and aren't they all polite, etc. If it was England or Australia, I think Neil Wagner would be considered a big loss to South African cricket. I think a lot of fans and former players would be bemoaning the Kolpak and the quota system, and it would be part of the discourse. I mean, remember when Keaton Jennings scored 100 on debut, and Jacques Cullis said, "Oh, another one slips through the cracks." When it's like, no, hang on, Jacques Keaton's mom is English. He was always going to go there, and you didn't notice the first season when he didn't score any runs, and only now you're noticing. So I think if Wagner was playing for England, yeah, it would have been plugged into the culture war. But because he played for New Zealand, it wasn't. Or isn't.
No, that I think that's very fair as well. Oh, Wagner's mum or dad is English. You wrote in your piece.
Did I?
Forgotten, haven't you?
I have forgotten. Yeah.
One of his parents. So that's another interesting thing that he chose New Zealand. So he really was choosing the culture of New Zealand cricket and everything else. But sorry, I didn't mean to throw you there. Well, you wrote that anyway. Okay. So
I just searched on my article. I obviously didn't mention that. I think you got that from someone else.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully I got that right. Or I just made it up. So he goes to New Zealand, and I think one of the more interesting things is that at that stage, the Neil Wagner that we know now was very different. And as a bowler, he bowled more South African lengths, which were more hard lengths, and obviously, back of a length. So he had to pitch it up more in New Zealand. But also, he was like Andre Nell. Like, you listen to the early reports, and I think hopefully this was in your piece and not someone else's, that Trent Boult mimicked him in his first class game and started making fun of him on the field because they thought he was ridiculous.
Yeah. He was that was in my piece. He was very honest about that. He basically said that he felt like a fool because he felt that there was a South African way of playing. I mean, I remember when I played my first club game in England, I felt like a fool because it's an Australian thing, it's a South African thing. I don't know, because we see cricket as an avenue for our masculinity, I guess, more so than any other country. I mean, India do it, but in a way that isn't the same as the Australians and South Africans. The Kiwis just aren't like that, and I don't want to be. I don't want to paint an entire nation and an entire cricket culture with one brush, but I think that's pretty fair that they don't view it in the same way. So, yeah, when he got over there, he was fluking. That's one for the South Africans. He was swearing, he was shouting, he was giving these evil eyes, and those aren't the pitches where you can bowl those lengths, as you rightly say. You get pulled in front of square with the front foot, as I think Pope did to him in this most recent game, and yeah, it's just not the way. And he could have, he could have thought, well, I'm going to do it my way because that's what brought me success. But fair play to him. He recognized immediately. He said he didn't do it ever again. He said there were occasions where he'd get angry and would have a word, but he wouldn't behave in that way. And I asked him why, and he said it's because he wanted to, do as the Romans are doing. He wanted to be on board with that culture. He had come over. He had been welcomed in, and I think his entire process. He says that he identifies as a New Zealander, and identity is in athletes who represent other countries from which they were born. I find that eternally fascinating. I think that's one of the great things of our sport, that we ask these guys to go out and represent a country and all its values and politics and history and wear the flag on their chest, but they could come from halfway across the world, right? But he fully bought onto that. And he from that day that Boult mocked him, he said that he wanted to be a New Zealand cricketer in whatever guise that was expected of him, and he's always done that. I guess apart from bowling bounce after bouncer.
It's interesting. He dominates Plunkett almost straight away, and so he does change his line and his length and becomes a really good bowler. But when he gets to Test cricket, he doesn't really do that much. And my first thoughts were, I can't remember when I first started noticing that things were different, but my first thoughts were, well, he's not quick enough and he's not accurate enough, and he doesn't have any particular skills that are Test match quality at this point. And you look at his early record, and to be fair, that's how he was bowling. Then he plays one game in Auckland, I think it was, against India, where in the second innings, he just starts bowling bouncers. And from that point forwards, he completely reinvents himself in a way that no other bowler ever has. And I've never talked to him, so I know he's seen my video, probably cringing through his eyes at every part of it. But I know he's seen the video, but I've never talked to him. He doesn't like being seen as the bouncer guy. I know that from a fact. I'm pretty sure Monga wrote a piece, or Barrett, one of them wrote a piece, and he was, no, I'm much more than that. But when you look at the data, no one has ever bowled that before. And I do wonder, it was that desperation to always be a professional, trying your luck in England, trying your luck in New Zealand, changing to fit into New Zealand culture, all these different things. If it almost needs that sort of perfect alchemy to become the weirdest bowler that we've ever had in Test cricket.
Yeah, it's interesting because I really wanted it. I reached out to him after watching your video, and I was armed with all the stats that you'd mentioned. What was at the time, um, since he's averaged 24.7 since he started bowling bouncers. 60% of them have come. 60% of his 188 wickets at the time had come courtesy of the short stuff. How's that little second mention of the bouncer? 15% more than anyone else. So yeah, I was like, mate, you're the bouncer king. Let's talk about it. And it was almost like trying to contend with a Neil Wagner bouncer. He just kept evading it. He just refused to play it. He wouldn't play the pull shot at all. And I was like, man, you got to give me. I remember saying to him, I was like, mate, you got to give me something, because I've sort of pitched to my editor that we're going to be talking about the bouncer, and I've been commissioned 2,000 words on this. So can you please give me something? And he just said that he'd give anything for his country, and if that's what is successful at the time, he'd assess the situation. It's not necessarily a go-to. It's a good weapon to have in the back pocket. So, and I found that quite weird. I wonder if it's because, if it's like the Eagles being asked to go on stage and they just don't want to sing Hotel California. It's just. But which is so strange to me, because as a fast bowler, especially a guy who came up in South Africa, and who started his journey in New Zealand being the big alpha who screamed and shouted, there's nothing more alpha than bouncing someone out. So you would think that he'd want to lean on it. I mean, I've spoken to many fast bowlers who love talking about the bouncer. It's what they want to talk about.
I can't think of another fast bowler who you bring it up and doesn't at least have, like if you talk to Mitchell Johnson, he's always got a bit of a smirk about it. Harmy is another one. All these guys, Goffey will talk about, slipping them in. I can't think of another fast bowler who I spent a lot of time around who, when you bring it up, doesn't at least smile as if to go, yeah, at whatever. And you're talking about now the guy who has bowled the most bouncers ever. And and it's so weird. I do find it. I find that juxtaposition so weird, which may mean that he's become more New Zealand than any New Zealander ever. I don't know how far he's changed, but this is one reason I wanted to do the podcast. Obviously, I've covered him a lot, but the one thing that I did feel is that he is this amazing mixture of a South African and a New Zealander. And by South African, I typically mean proper Dutchman. Which is the phrase that I think the first time I heard proper Dutchman used about Wagner was Sean Pollock, when I was talking about, we were commentating together, and I said something about he was talking about how great South African bowlers were, and I said, well, Neil Wagner's pretty good too. And he goes, yeah, he's a proper Dutchman. And I had to go and Google the phrase and ask all my friends what the hell he was talking about. And then afterwards I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty obvious. That makes sense. So from that perspective, he bowls those crazy long spells, but then you look at his fields, and with all due respect to South African cricket, they feel a little bit more advanced. They feel like Jeremy Coney is setting the fields, right? And Andre Nell is bowling. Does that make sense? There's so much thought and skill and effort and everything in it. New Zealand couldn't have done it on their own, and I don't know if South Africa could have done it on its own.
Yeah, I love that Coney setting the fields for Andre Nell. Wouldn't that have been a fun thing? Yeah, and that's just one of the joys of international sport, isn't it? And why the Neil Wagner story is so much fun, because he wouldn't have done this in South Africa. He just, like you said, he wasn't quick enough on those wickets. He would have dug it in short and been pulled, not in front of square but back at a square. The keeper would have never been standing up to him. What was the point of this guy? And I'm not saying that New Zealand wouldn't have won the World Test Championship and wouldn't have had this remarkable team. This I don't want to call it a dynasty, kind of dynasty last 3 years, but it wouldn't have had this championship winning Test team for that cycle without him. But he was an integral part of that, and he gave them something that no other bowler, maybe not just in the side, but as you're saying, in the world had. They had this really potent weapon that could break games open when it was flat and the other bowlers were knackered, and he'd bowl into the wind and he'd bowl forever. So yeah, it's a perfect mix. On him trying to be so Kiwi, yeah, it reminds me of, I'm Jewish, and whenever like a family member marries someone from outside the faith and they convert. And I guess it's with any convert to religion, they become so religious, And I think you're right. I think if he stayed in South Africa and became the Bouncer King, he would have got a tattoo of Bouncer King on his pecs or something, because that would have been a badge of honor. But yeah, it's the more I talk about it, I mean, he's just not a bowler I ever think about. You know, I'm not going to tell my kid about him. I wonder outside of the cricket nerdy circles if people talk about him, but he's such a fascinating character, and he's such a product of the modern game. And yeah, I love him to bits.
It's funny you say you won't tell your kid about him, because I think that realistically, he's the sort of professional athlete we should be telling children about, right? In that things were just stacked against him. I mean, politically, where he was from, the first class structure at that time, all those sorts of things, you know, going to New Zealand, everything else. I just feel like, and then you look at it, he really should have finished his career playing 20 tests and, you know, and no one remembering him. Right. And yet the opposite is true. It's a remarkable story. Thank you very much for your work with him. And it's a real shame that he ruined your piece.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thanks, Jarrod.